So I was going to briefly highlight just an overview of some of the invasive species impacts, talk about management options, and then share some resources. Then we can jump into some of the state and federal priorities. I do want to acknowledge that this morning I'm coming from the traditional homelands of the Puyallup tribe of Indians, where I really had the privilege to fall in love with the Puget Sound and learn to appreciate the lands that many tribal communities, many Coast Salish communities have stewarded since time immemorial. I'm here today really because of this gentleman, Dan Fagerly, who's a superhero in my mind and a mentor of mine who's led me into this space, and I'm following his lead in terms of developing and providing educational materials with tribal communities about invasive species. So this morning I was going to run through some impacts real quickly. I did want to highlight that, again, I'm here because of Dan, but also because we have funding from the federal USDA APHIS program. And we have funding through this public outreach and education goal. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a minute. So in terms of impacts, we're really facing the impacts of invasive species across all of our lands. And if we look at tidelands, European green crabs affecting many of our Coast Salish communities. We manage for clam gardens and things like that. This species will have a substantial impact. There's a bunch of different methods to manage because in some places it's pretty well established, whereas others it hasn't even been detected yet. So there's opportunities for early detection and eradication. Spartina is another invasive plant, aquatic plant that is affecting a lot of our tidelands. And so just really changing ecosystems. Not going to go too much into detail about the actual impacts, but did want to highlight that Swinomish has done an incredible job managing this in the tidelands of the Swinomish homelands. So some really neat stuff out there on that. And I apologize for flying through this, but I just want to keep us on time as best as possible. There's a neat story map about eradicating Spartina if you want to Google that and learn more. In terms of stream habitat, there's a lot of invasive aquatic plants that are pretty gnarly and clearly changing the environment and ecosystem in those streams. Brazilian Lodia and Eurasian water milfoil are two examples of pretty impactful species in the Northwest that we're struggling with in our stream habitats and clearly having impacts. In terms of the forest land, we're going to hear a bit more about this from some of our colleagues this morning, but spongy moth is a pretty aggressive invader that we're concerned with. Emerald ash borer is going to change riparian ecosystems in Southwest Washington and Oregon from the virtual elimination of our Oregon ash in these systems. Longhorn beetles are a huge concern. Clinton Campbell, I think, will speak a bit about this afternoon. In some cases, it affects us in odd ways where we may order fireworks or something else internationally, but those shipments are rejected because of these insects as well. Sudden oak death is an invasive microbe that has changed the structure and function of a lot of our forests in Oregon and California with the virtual elimination of tan oak species. But this pathogen, this microbe that we accidentally introduced, also affects other cultural resources like our like red huckleberry and some of the other berry species. But in addition to that species, we're also faced with impacts from spotted wing Drosophila and some options and some methods you might consider for reducing those impacts in our berry harvesting spaces. In terms of rangeland impacts, yellow star thistle can have pretty dramatic impacts. Knapweeds is a big one, as many of our speakers will know and talk about. We're going to hear a little bit about wildlife diseases like elk hoof disease and chronic wasting disease throughout this series of online stuff. Online sessions. And of course, there's also concerns with other wildlife like our amphibians and our bat communities. So really invasive species are impacting our lands and resources across the board. And it's really critical that we have the resources and can act to reduce those impacts. In terms of options, there's really a few different places you may be able to invest your resources. You can invest in preventing or detecting things early, or you can invest in containing and eradicating from local areas. So each one's going to have a different cost. Clearly, the more established something is, like this star thistle, at this point, it's going to be pretty costly to try and control something that's very widespread. But in terms of Japanese beetle, for example, it's in a much smaller area and may be possible to contain or reduce its impact or prevent it from spreading to other areas if we can act while it's in a limited area. One that hasn't even been found in Washington or the Northwest really yet is this spotted lanternfly, which we'll hear a bit more from Cassie at the end of the session. It's an example of an introduction of a species that we could reduce at relatively low cost if we can detect it early. So, some other examples, European green crab, it's pretty well established in some areas, but and maybe it's not economical across the board to try and eradicate or control it, but you still have the option on your own traditional homelands and other areas to try and do that. Whoa, I would never zoomed into a slide like that. We're also going to hear, we have a whole webinar organized on April 2nd about the quagga mussel detection in Idaho recently. And so we're going to talk about, how eradicating or controlling it as soon as you find it can really save and prevent the impacts downstream. But as I mentioned, some things may not be regulated federally because they're really expensive or they're really widespread. But on your own homelands or your own communities, it may still be beneficial and worthy, and there's resources available for you to try and reduce those impacts. If you're trying to reduce the impacts and prevent the introduction, it's really important to think about pathways, and Yolanda's going to share about pathways on Thursday. So I encourage you to think about that. It's also really important when you think about trying to control on your side of the fence when your neighbors are not taking any action at all. And so there's a couple different ways to find common ground, and that maybe through educational resources, which we can talk a bit about now. So there's a lot of different opportunities for funding. I mentioned earlier, we have support from USDA APHIS through their education and outreach goal on their section 7721 program. And we're going to hear more about all of these or many of these in the funding and resources webinar towards the end of April 23rd. So I encourage you to join. We're trying to get some more speakers in that session about these resources. So stay tuned and let me know if I can help with any of that. This again is the APHIS funding that's supporting us every year. They have these calls for suggestions. It's pretty competitive, but there's money set aside for tribal communities in all cases. So feel free and let us know if we can support you in that. And I'll talk a bit more about this in the resources webinar. With that money from APHIS, we've been able to create these educational materials. So we produce signs, and these are some examples of drafts that we've sent to partners and communities on these calls. We also have funding to create these boot brush stations so you can prevent the accidental introduction of invasive plants by removing the seeds from your shoes or the soil that could contain microbes. And so you're welcome to reach out in for any of these resources. There's a web form, or you can email me. The other thing is that we have funding, and we're happy to purchase either of these books for you and your team if there's a need. So there's a web form available where you can fill that out and request these, and we'll do our best to help address those needs and provide you with some of these field guides for invasive species. On the webpage that we register, there's also some resources, but there's also incredible recordings from last year's webinar and workshops. So I encourage you to browse those recordings. There's a lot on there, and there's probably 30 or so. Some really incredible stuff. Anthony will be speaking later, but he provided a really awesome overview of some of the impacts from the Nimipu perspective. We've talked about northern pike, we've talked about noxious weeds, and so many of the folks already on these calls and giving an update or a different perspective will be sharing, and together we're creating this incredible library of recordings. So please browse those, check those out.